By late 1944, air operations over Central Europe had become a continuous process rather than a series of distinct battles. Fighter patrols crossed the same airspace hour after hour, guided by radar stations and ground observers whose reports were often incomplete and delayed. Aircraft appeared briefly, disappeared into cloud layers, and re-emerged elsewhere, making sustained tracking difficult. Most encounters followed a predictable pattern. Contact was established, firing passes were attempted, and aircraft disengaged within minutes due to fuel limitations, weather conditions, or loss of visual contact. These engagements were logged routinely and rarely revisited once concluded. Occasionally, however, records reflected activity that did not conform to this pattern. Radar plots showed a single contact remaining within a confined area longer than expected. Ground observers noted repeated maneuvering at varying altitudes without corresponding loss reports. Maintenance documentation later recorded damage inconsistent with brief interception. At the time, these details attracted little attention. The air war had reached a scale where individual incidents were absorbed into daily summaries and operational reports. The absence of confirmed victories or losses further reduced the likelihood of follow-up. Only later did the fragments align. A prolonged engagement. Multiple opposing patrols rotating through the same airspace. A single aircraft remaining engaged throughout. The sequence begins on the morning of October 14, 1944. On October 14, 1944, the air situation over central and southern Germany reflected the deteriorating strategic position of the Luftwaffe. Allied air forces maintained near-continuous presence over Kiev. Fighter patrols operated in overlapping waves, supported by radar coverage and forward air controllers. German fighter units faced severe shortages of fuel, replacement aircraft, and experienced pilots. Operational readiness varied widely between squadrons, with many aircraft grounded for lack of spare parts or aviation fuel. Weather conditions that morning were unstable. Low-pressure systems moved eastward, producing broken cloud layers at multiple altitudes. Visibility fluctuated rapidly depending on position relative to cloud cover. These conditions favored experienced pilots capable of using terrain and weather tactically, but they also complicated coordination between units and reduced the effectiveness of ground-controlled interception. At approximately 9:20 local time, radar stations reported multiple enemy fighter formations entering controlled airspace from the west. These formations were not part of a single large strike but consisted of several patrol elements operating independently within the same general sector. Such tactics had become increasingly common by late 1944, allowing Allied fighters to overwhelm isolated defenders through numerical superiority and repeated engagements. A single German fighter aircraft was ordered to scramble from a forward airfield supporting regional air defense. Available records identify the aircraft as a single-seat interceptor assigned to a depleted fighter unit. No wingmen were available for immediate takeoff. Ground crews completed a rapid pre-flight under time constraints, noting reduced fuel load consistent with short-notice interception rather than extended patrol. The aircraft became airborne within minutes. Initial climb was conducted at high engine output to gain altitude as quickly as possible. Radio traffic from the sector indicated multiple engagements already in progress, suggesting that the incoming enemy formations were encountering scattered resistance rather than coordinated opposition. No direct radio contact was established between the scrambling pilot and other friendly aircraft. By approximately 9:31, the pilot reached an altitude sufficient to establish visual contact. Enemy aircraft were observed maneuvering above and ahead, silhouetted intermittently against broken cloud layers. The number of hostile fighters visible at any one moment varied, as formations entered and exited cloud cover. Ground observers and radar plots later suggested that up to 12 enemy aircraft passed through the engagement zone during the subsequent 40 minutes. Standard Luftwaffe procedure in such circumstances emphasized disengagement when facing overwhelming numbers, particularly in the absence of friendly support. However, operational realities by late 1944 often forced pilots into defensive engagements to delay enemy operations or disrupt patrol patterns. The pilot maintained climb briefly before leveling off to assess relative positions. The first attack occurred shortly after visual contact was established. One enemy fighter initiated a diving pass from above, followed seconds later by another approaching from a different bearing. The German aircraft responded with a sharp turn into the attack, reducing closure speed and forcing the attacker to overshoot. No sustained firing was recorded during this initial exchange. Between 9:32 and 9:35, the engagement intensified. Additional enemy aircraft entered the area, attacking in staggered passes rather than coordinated formations. The German fighter executed repeated defensive maneuvers, alternating between horizontal turns and vertical climbs to break firing solutions. Cloud cover was used extensively, with the aircraft repeatedly disappearing into cloud layers before re-emerging at altered headings. Radio monitoring stations recorded brief, fragmented transmissions referencing an ongoing engagement involving a single friendly aircraft. These transmissions contained no distress calls and no requests for assistance. They primarily consisted of position updates and acknowledgments of ground instructions, suggesting that the pilot retained situational awareness and control. As the fight continued, altitude fluctuated significantly. The engagement descended rapidly during several attack sequences before climbing again to higher levels. Engine performance remained within operational limits, though later inspection would reveal signs of prolonged high-output operation. Fuel consumption increased accordingly, reducing remaining endurance with each maneuver. By 9:40, the engagement had lasted nearly 10 minutes. Enemy aircraft continued to rotate through the combat zone, with some disengaging after brief encounters and others taking their place. This pattern created the impression of a sustained numerical advantage, even though not all 12 aircraft were present simultaneously. At approximately 9:42, ground observers reported seeing tracer fire at high altitude followed by abrupt changes in aircraft orientation. These observations correspond with maintenance reports indicating superficial damage sustained during this phase, including minor impacts to control surfaces and fuselage panels. No critical systems failures were recorded. Enemy tactics shifted gradually as the engagement progressed. Rather than isolated diving attacks, several enemy fighters attempted coordinated approaches, attacking from opposing directions to limit escape options. The German aircraft responded by exploiting vertical space, entering steep climbs followed by rapid rolls and dives. These maneuvers repeatedly disrupted enemy firing angles but imposed additional strain on the aircraft and pilot. Between 9:45 and 9:50, the fight moved closer to lower cloud layers. Visibility decreased, and several attack runs were aborted due to loss of visual contact. The German fighter briefly disappeared from ground observation during this phase, reappearing moments later at a lower altitude and altered heading. No parachutes or wreckage were observed, confirming continued flight. Radio logs from this period record repeated references to an unidentified German fighter, still engaged, and not disengaging. These notes appear in sector summaries rather than individual mission reports, indicating that the engagement was monitored indirectly rather than through direct coordination. By the 20-minute mark, fuel reserves were becoming a limiting factor. With no opportunity to disengage safely and enemy aircraft still present, the pilot continued defensive maneuvers while gradually allowing altitude to decrease. This reduced engine load slightly but increased vulnerability to attack from above. Enemy aircraft began to show signs of disengagement. Several were observed breaking off after brief passes, likely due to fuel constraints, ammunition expenditure, or minor combat damage. The total number of attackers remained difficult to determine, as new aircraft occasionally entered the area while others withdrew. At approximately 9:55, the German fighter sustained additional damage. Maintenance logs later documented further impacts consistent with machine gun fire, including punctures to fuselage panels and damage to external components. Control effectiveness remained intact. No fire or catastrophic damage was observed. Despite sustained pressure, the aircraft continued to maneuver effectively. The pilot avoided prolonged straight flight, minimizing exposure during withdrawal attempts. The engagement gradually shifted eastward as altitude decreased and the aircraft moved closer to friendly controlled territory. By around 10 o'clock, after nearly 40 minutes of continuous combat, enemy presence diminished noticeably. Ground observers reported fewer hostile aircraft in the immediate area. The German fighter was seen flying at low altitude, trailing light exhaust smoke but maintaining stable flight characteristics. No enemy pursuit was observed at this stage. The aircraft exited the combat zone and proceeded toward an auxiliary airfield rather than returning to its original base. This decision likely reflected fuel limitations and aircraft condition. The landing was completed without incident shortly afterward. Post-flight inspection revealed extensive superficial damage. Multiple bullet impacts were documented across the airframe. Engine components showed signs of overheating but remained functional. Control systems were damaged but operable. No critical structural failures were identified. The pilot reported an engagement duration of approximately 40 minutes and described repeated attacks by numerous enemy fighters. Due to the chaotic nature of the fight and lack of confirmed observations, no official victory claims were submitted. The incident was recorded as an exceptional defensive engagement under adverse conditions. The record remained within unit operational files and was referenced in broader sector summaries. No formal commendation was issued, and the event did not receive public attention during the war. Subsequent review of Allied operational records provided partial confirmation of the scale of the engagement. Several enemy fighter units reported brief encounters with a single German aircraft during the same time window and within overlapping geographic coordinates. These reports were scattered across different squadron logs and did not initially appear connected. Individual entries described short, inconclusive engagements, aborted attacks due to loss of contact, or momentary sightings of a German fighter executing abrupt evasive maneuvers. None of the Allied pilots involved claimed confirmed victories related to this engagement. Several reports noted difficulty maintaining firing position due to aggressive defensive flying and frequent use of cloud cover. Fuel considerations were mentioned repeatedly, as patrol aircraft operating at extended range were required to disengage after limited time on station. Ammunition expenditure during these brief encounters was recorded as minimal to moderate. Post-war reconstruction efforts later correlated timestamps from Allied mission logs with German radar plots and airfield records. This process revealed that the encounters described by different Allied pilots aligned chronologically with the same 40-minute period. While no single Allied formation reported sustained combat, the cumulative evidence indicated repeated contact with the same German aircraft as patrol elements rotated through the sector. The German unit to which the aircraft belonged was operating under reduced strength at the time. Personnel records show that the squadron had suffered significant losses during the preceding weeks, with experienced pilots increasingly tasked with multiple sorties per day. Aircraft availability fluctuated, and maintenance crews worked under constant pressure to keep remaining fighters operational. Fuel allocations were tightly controlled, often limiting missions to short-duration interceptions. The pilot involved in the engagement was recorded as having returned visibly exhausted but uninjured. Medical examination conducted shortly after landing noted signs consistent with prolonged high-stress flight, including fatigue and dehydration. No injuries from combat damage were reported. The pilot was grounded temporarily pending aircraft repair and recovery. Aircraft repair documentation provides further insight into the intensity of the engagement. Damage reports list multiple small-caliber impacts distributed across the fuselage, wings, and tail section. Several control linkages required adjustment or replacement due to deformation. Engine components showed thermal stress consistent with extended operation at near maximum power settings. Despite this, the airframe was deemed reparable and returned to service after several days. The absence of formal recognition for the engagement reflects standard Luftwaffe administrative practice by late 1944. Confirmation of aerial victories required corroborating evidence, which was unavailable in this case due to the nature of the fight and lack of ground observation of enemy losses. Defensive engagements without confirmed results were routinely logged without further action. Sector command summaries for that day briefly referenced an extended defensive combat by a single fighter against numerically superior enemy aircraft. No pilot name was included. The reference appeared among numerous other entries documenting air activity across the region, and it did not receive special emphasis. The operational environment in which the engagement occurred contributed to its obscurity. By October 1944, air combat over Germany had become continuous and fragmented. Isolated encounters were common, and many were never fully reconstructed. The focus of command attention remained on strategic air defense rather than individual actions, particularly as resources dwindled. After the war, surviving records from both sides were reviewed by historians and archivists attempting to reconstruct late-war air operations. The engagement appeared intermittently in cross-referenced logs but lacked sufficient detail to form a complete standalone account. As a result, it remained an isolated data point within broader analyses of air combat during the period. No photographic evidence of the engagement exists. No gun camera footage from either side was recovered that could be conclusively linked to the event. The reconstruction relies entirely on written records, timing correlations, and maintenance documentation. The pilot survived the war. Post-war personnel records indicate continued service until the cessation of hostilities. No personal memoirs or interviews specifically describing the engagement were located in available archives. The event remains known primarily through operational documentation rather than personal testimony. The engagement stands as an example of the type of combat increasingly common during the final year of the war: brief, intense, fragmented, and often poorly documented. It illustrates the conditions under which individual aircraft could become engaged repeatedly by numerically superior opponents without producing clear outcomes or formal recognition. By late October 1944, the air situation had shifted further against German defensive forces. Fuel shortages worsened, aircraft losses increased, and operational flexibility diminished. Engagements similar to the one recorded on October 14 became more frequent, though few were reconstructed in comparable detail. The records related to this incident remained unchanged in post-war archival compilations. No additional documentation was discovered that altered the original assessment. The engagement continues to be recorded as a prolonged defensive action by a single fighter against multiple enemy aircraft, lasting approximately 40 minutes and concluding with the successful recovery of the aircraft and pilot. After the aircraft landed at the auxiliary field, routine operational activity resumed immediately. The airfield was functioning under reduced capacity, handling a continuous flow of damaged and refueling aircraft throughout the day. Ground crews prioritized rapid turnaround over detailed examination, as incoming reports indicated continued enemy activity across multiple sectors. The pilot was directed to standard post-flight procedures without delay. Initial documentation focused on flight duration, estimated fuel consumption, engine behavior, and observable aircraft damage. These details were recorded on standardized forms designed to capture essential operational data rather than narrative accounts of combat. No effort was made at this stage to reconstruct the sequence of the engagement beyond approximate timings. The pilot's estimates regarding the number of opposing aircraft were recorded with qualification. Variations in reported figures were noted but not resolved. Similar discrepancies were common in late-war records, particularly in engagements involving cloud cover and repeated contact. The absence of gun camera confirmation or ground observation of enemy losses limited further clarification. Throughout the late morning and early afternoon, ground observation posts submitted additional reports covering the period of the engagement. These entries described sustained aerial maneuvering at varying altitudes, occasional bursts of tracer fire, and repeated loss and re-establishment of visual contact. Several reports referenced the same general coordinates but differed in altitude estimates and timing. No attempt was made to consolidate these reports at the unit level. Radar station logs for the sector were compiled as part of routine daily summaries. Operators noted intermittent contacts consistent with high-speed maneuvering rather than stable flight paths. The density of air traffic in adjacent sectors complicated efforts to isolate individual tracks. As a result, the engagement was not flagged for immediate review or special annotation. Maintenance personnel conducted a preliminary inspection once operational demands allowed. Damage assessment was technical and compartmentalized. Individual components were examined, catalogued, and assigned repair priorities. Bullet impacts were mapped without reference to engagement chronology. Engine performance issues were attributed to extended high-power operation, a condition frequently observed during late-war interceptions. Fuel records indicated that the aircraft landed below recommended reserve levels. This information was logged as a routine operational deviation. Similar entries appeared frequently in squadron records during this period, reflecting the increasing mismatch between mission requirements and available resources. No supplementary inquiries were initiated during the days immediately following the engagement. The aircraft entered the repair cycle and was returned to service after necessary work was completed. The pilot was reassigned to operational duties once cleared medically and administratively. Weekly operational summaries produced by Sector Command included a brief reference to prolonged defensive contact by a friendly fighter. The entry appeared among numerous other reports and did not receive additional commentary. No follow-up documentation was requested from the unit. Correspondence between command levels during this period reflects prioritization of broader strategic concerns. Air defense coverage, fuel allocation, and aircraft redistribution dominated reporting. Individual engagements without confirmed outcomes were treated as routine. At this stage, the engagement existed only as a set of disconnected records. Pilot debrief forms, maintenance logs, radar summaries, and observer reports remained filed within separate administrative channels. No mechanism existed at the time to integrate these sources into a unified account. Several weeks later, portions of these records were consolidated as part of routine archival processing. The engagement was neither expanded nor revised during this process. It remained recorded as an extended defensive action without further qualification. The lack of immediate analytical follow-up was consistent with conditions prevailing during the final months of the war. High operational tempo, resource shortages, and continuous enemy pressure limited the capacity for retrospective examination. Documentation focused on sustaining operations rather than reconstructing individual incidents. As a result, the engagement passed into the archival system without narrative synthesis. It awaited later examination, when records from multiple sides and multiple levels of command could be viewed together. Post-war examination of Allied operational archives allowed a more detailed reconstruction of the opposing forces involved in the engagement. Mission logs from several Allied fighter groups operating over central Germany on October 14, 1944 recorded routine patrol activity rather than a coordinated strike. These patrols were assigned overlapping sectors and staggered flight times, resulting in repeated contact with any enemy aircraft encountered in the area. The Allied fighters involved were operating under standing orders to seek and engage enemy aircraft whenever encountered. Patrol altitudes varied, with some units flying high cover while others operated at medium and low altitudes. This layered presence increased the likelihood that a single defending aircraft would face repeated engagements as it moved vertically and horizontally through the airspace. Individual Allied squadron records describe brief encounters lasting only minutes. Several pilots reported attacking a lone German fighter that maneuvered aggressively and repeatedly avoided sustained engagement. In some cases, pilots noted difficulty maintaining visual contact due to cloud cover and abrupt changes in altitude by the defending aircraft. No reports describe prolonged dogfights from the Allied perspective. Fuel considerations played a significant role in limiting Allied engagement time. Many patrols operated near the limits of their endurance, particularly those flying from forward bases recently established on the continent. Logs frequently note disengagement due to fuel state rather than combat damage. This factor contributed to the rotation of enemy aircraft through the engagement zone. Ammunition expenditure reports from Allied units indicate low to moderate usage during the relevant timeframe. This suggests that while firing passes were made, few sustained firing opportunities were achieved. No confirmed claims were submitted for the period that could be conclusively matched to the German aircraft involved in the engagement. Radar records from Allied ground control stations show intermittent contacts consistent with a single aircraft repeatedly changing altitude and heading. These contacts align temporally with German radar plots showing one friendly aircraft remaining airborne within the same sector longer than average for an interception mission. The correlation supports the conclusion that multiple Allied patrols encountered the same defending fighter. German air defense records from the region indicate no other friendly fighters operating independently in that sector during the relevant timeframe. This reduces the likelihood that Allied pilots were encountering multiple German aircraft and supports the assessment that the reports refer to a single aircraft. The reconstruction of enemy numbers was achieved by compiling Allied mission timelines and mapping points of contact. While no Allied formation reported 12 aircraft engaging simultaneously, the cumulative total of fighters entering the engagement area over 40 minutes reached that number. The defending aircraft encountered these opponents sequentially rather than as a unified group. Post-war analysts noted that this pattern of engagement became increasingly common as Allied air superiority expanded. Patrol-based operations created a continuous presence that could overwhelm isolated defenders without requiring massed formations. For German pilots, this resulted in engagements that appeared numerically unbalanced despite the absence of coordinated enemy attacks. Further examination of German maintenance and logistics records confirms that the aircraft involved had been assigned a reduced fuel load consistent with short interception missions. This detail underscores the prolonged nature of the engagement, as the aircraft remained airborne well beyond typical expectations for such a sortie. Fuel consumption data suggest that the pilot managed engine settings carefully during later stages of the fight to preserve remaining reserves. The absence of radio distress signals or emergency procedures during the engagement indicates that the aircraft remained under control throughout. Ground control did not issue explicit disengagement orders, likely due to fragmented communications and competing priorities across multiple sectors experiencing simultaneous air activity. Personnel records reveal that the pilot continued flying operational missions after the aircraft was repaired. No special designation or annotation related to the engagement appears in service files. This reflects the administrative environment of the period, in which individual actions were frequently subsumed within broader operational demands. The engagement was not included in official propaganda or morale materials. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe lacked both the resources and strategic incentive to highlight individual defensive actions. Focus remained on managing diminishing capabilities rather than celebrating isolated successes. Archival consolidation in the post-war period brought together German and Allied records, enabling cross-referencing that had not been possible during the conflict. Despite this, the engagement remained sparsely documented compared to earlier war actions. Many records were incomplete, damaged, or lost, limiting the precision of reconstruction. No evidence suggests that the engagement influenced subsequent tactics or operational planning on either side. It stands as a documented occurrence within the routine flow of late-war air combat rather than a turning point or anomaly in strategic terms. The incident is preserved primarily through its consistency across independent records. German operational summaries, Allied patrol logs, radar data, and maintenance reports all support the occurrence of a prolonged defensive engagement involving a single aircraft repeatedly attacked by multiple opponents over an extended period. The lack of definitive combat outcomes, such as confirmed victories or losses, contributed to the event's obscurity. In an environment characterized by constant air activity and high attrition, engagements without clear results were rarely emphasized. The record remains unchanged in modern archival collections. No additional documentation has surfaced to alter the established reconstruction. The engagement continues to be noted as a sustained defensive action lasting approximately 40 minutes, involving sequential contact with up to 12 enemy fighters, and concluding with the successful return of the aircraft and pilot. In the weeks that followed the engagement, the operational environment in which it occurred continued to deteriorate. Air activity over the region increased further, and similar defensive interceptions became routine. Individual incidents blended into a continuous pattern of air combat, recorded in daily summaries without distinction between routine encounters and exceptional actions. The engagement of October 14, 1944 was not revisited by command staff and did not prompt additional reporting beyond the original entries. The aircraft involved returned to service after repairs were completed. Maintenance logs show that several components replaced after the engagement were later replaced again within a short period, reflecting the overall strain placed on airframes during this phase of the war. The aircraft's subsequent operational history does not contain any annotation linking it to the earlier engagement. It was treated as one of many serviceable fighters cycling through a shrinking inventory. The airfield from which the aircraft had departed underwent repeated Allied air attacks during the following months. Damage reports indicate progressive degradation of infrastructure, including hangars, fuel storage, and repair facilities. By early 1945, the field was no longer capable of supporting sustained fighter operations. Remaining aircraft were relocated or destroyed to prevent capture. Radar stations and ground observation posts that had monitored the engagement were reassigned or abandoned as front lines shifted. Many original logs survived only in fragmented form. Others were consolidated into summary documents that preserved timing and location data but omitted narrative detail. The engagement remained identifiable only through cross-reference timestamps and coinciding reports. The Allied units involved continued routine patrol operations in the same airspace for the remainder of the year. Their mission logs reflect the same pattern seen on October 14, brief contacts, incomplete engagements, disengagement due to fuel limitations, and frequent encounters with single enemy aircraft operating without support. No reference was made to the cumulative nature of these encounters at the time. After the cessation of hostilities, archival efforts brought together records from both sides. Analysts reviewing the material noted the unusual duration of the engagement when German and Allied documents were examined side by side. Despite this, the lack of definitive combat outcomes limited further attention. The incident was catalogued and retained without expanded commentary. The pilot's post-war record contains no reference to the engagement beyond routine service entries. No decorations or special notations appear in surviving personnel files. There is no evidence of formal interviews conducted specifically about the event. The absence of personal testimony leaves the written record as the sole account. The engagement remains preserved as a sequence of logged observations, radar contacts appearing and disappearing, patrol aircraft entering and exiting the area, maintenance crews documenting damage, and operational summaries noting prolonged defensive activity by a single aircraft. These records, taken together, form a continuous but incomplete picture. No subsequent evidence emerged to contradict the original documentation. No additional aircraft losses were attributed to the engagement. No corrections were issued to the recorded duration or estimated number of opposing fighters. The event remained fixed within the archival record as originally logged. The airspace in which the engagement took place later became quiet. Military activity ceased, and civilian aviation eventually resumed under new conditions. The physical traces of the conflict were gradually removed, repurposed, or forgotten. Only the written records retained the sequence of events. The engagement of October 14, 1944 exists today as an entry among many others from the final year of the war. It is neither expanded nor diminished by later interpretation. It stands as recorded, a single aircraft, operating alone, engaged repeatedly by multiple opposing fighters over approximately 40 minutes, and returning intact. The documentation ends there.